Hi, this is Ralph Crystal here, and I'm here today to talk with you about family involvement in rehabilitation. And we've got some PowerPoint slides to look at, and as I go through this, I'm going to be referring to the different PowerPoint slides that I'm talking about. So let's start with PowerPoint slide number 1, benefits of family involvement in rehabilitation. And let me just start off by saying that I believe that the more we can involve families in the rehabilitation process, the better off we're going to be in terms of having positive vocational and employment outcomes. And to prove that point, some research studies indicate that employment increases and people sustain jobs once they are out in the community if the rehabilitation professional has had good involvement of family members and significant others. And when we talk about family involvement, I think it's important that we use kind of an expanded definition of families being individuals who would be in the sphere of being a significant other with the individual. So it could be blood relatives, it could be parents, it could be siblings, it could be extended family, or it could be just individuals that we would consider significant others who may not have a biological or marriage relationship with the individual. Also, in terms of not just having a greater likelihood of a positive employment outcome when we involve families, we also see that increased satisfaction with services by the rehabilitation consumer occurs. And I think also very significantly that when we involve family members, and I always felt this to be an important factor, if not the most important factor in involving family members, is that once we bring the family into the rehabilitation process, we're not isolating the family member. We're asking them for their perspective, for their viewpoint. And of course we do this with the approval and with the knowledge of our consumer, because obviously our consumer is the one that we're working with. And in order for us to be effective and in order for us to involve family members, we obviously need to get the approval of the significant other to meet with the family members, either with our consumer or without our consumer, whatever appears to be appropriate given the circumstances and the situation. And in my experience, when we do that, and sometimes it can be tricky because of privacy issues and so forth, but when we can do that, what we see is that we make the family member a stakeholder. We make the family member committed to what we're doing. So it's not as if we meet with a consumer, we talk about a rehabilitation approach, a rehabilitation plan, and then the consumer goes and talks to the significant others, and they have no input. They feel left out. They feel isolated. And I think meeting with family members in whatever kind of configuration would be appropriate, either together with the consumer or separately and together, again, reduces this fear and suspicion of the rehabilitation process. So I'm very much in favor of having family involvement and having family input. And I think we can do this, if we go to the second slide, at various stages. This can include when we do intake interviewing, going over vocational assessment results, doing counseling, doing planning. It's, to me, inviting the significant others to participate in these activities is important, as I said, because it reduces fear and suspicion, but it makes people stakeholders, and it also, from what I have seen, eliminates the possibility, which is always there, of significant others undermining or sabotaging the efforts that we are involved with. with the consumer. And we also can use the time that we have with the significant others to answer any questions they might have, talk about concerns they might have, and be able to address issues that come up that family members may have, and they may not know anything about the rehabilitation process. And so this gives us an opportunity when we meet with the significant others to be able to address their concerns, their questions, be able to get their input, and as I'll say in a few minutes, getting their perspective is very important. Hearing what they have to say about the consumer is very important, because that leads into the third slide that I've got titled Systems Approach, and that is by using a systems theory model, which is often used in family counseling, family therapy, we can see the individual in the context of the family constellation, the family network, how the person responds to family members. If we only meet with the consumer individually, we may not get that overall picture of what the total aspect of the individual is. For example, I've been in situations where I meet with the consumer, and I get one picture of how that person's functioning based upon how that person wants me to kind of perceive him or her, and then I meet with significant others, and I might get a very different perspective on that individual. So you might ask, which is right, which is wrong? I don't think there's a right or a wrong, but I think what we have are different perspectives. And people come to the rehabilitation table, so to speak, with different perhaps agendas, and it's important for us to tease out of those interactions what the real situation is. And that may entail looking through the records, maybe reading reports, seeing what other professionals, other individuals who treated or evaluated the person have had to say about the individual, and then going from there, and then trying to use the information that we glean, not in any sort of vindictive way or gotcha way, but in a way that we can use it to the benefit of the consumer, which may mean working together with consumers and significant others to say, well, you know, your perspective on going to work is this, and your perspective is that, or your perspective on how you function in the world is like this, and, you know, your family members over here are saying that, you know, that you've had some difficulties with some of the things that you're saying you have some that are not problems. So you might say, let me try to understand what this is about. Another thing that's significant in working with families is that we often see that family members very frequently kind of stick together. That family members don't always have an objective perspective on the individual, and they may want to preserve the status quo in the family structure. They may, in some cases, want to keep the individual in, quote, a sick role, or they may want to be very protective and defensive about the individual. And again, what we're getting out of meeting with family members is seeing what the patterns are, seeing what the way people in the family structure interact. And you might see how one family member is an enabler, how another family member is overly protective. And so what we see would be, what are the dynamics in that family structure? Because, in my experience, what I have seen is that the consumer may buy into a rehabilitation plan that we talk about. The consumer may say, oh yes, I'm going to go out and look for a job tomorrow and the next day, and then go home, and all that gets sabotaged by family members for whatever reason. Maybe it's because of one family member trying to protect someone and is fearful of the person going out and working. Another family member may feel that if you go to work, then you'll lose your disability benefits. And these dynamics are things that we will not see unless we have the opportunity to actually go out and bring in family members. So we don't go out; they come to us, or we go to see them, and we see what is going on in that family dynamic and how people respond. And we don't have to act on everything that we see. We can just observe, but through those observations, that can tell us a lot as to who is significant in the family constellation, who is the person that kind of is in charge or not in charge, or are there some dynamics that we weren't aware of going on. Going to the fourth slide, what we have, it's titled Traditional versus Current, and in that it talks about how, traditionally in counseling, we look at the consumer as being the main person that we work with, and versus, as I said in the prior slide, where we talk about the family member as being part of a whole overall structure. And so my view is to bring that family member into the picture and focus on the consumer, but also focus on the consumer in the context of the overall environment that the person works in. And, you know, this doesn't have to be that complex either. There can be situations, let's say, for example, you refer the consumer to a community rehabilitation program or to a hospital for treatment, or for any sort of program the person is going into. And again, very simply, you could just invite family members to attend an orientation meeting. In fact, you can invite family members to come, if that's the environment you work in. You can invite family members on an open house day, have people come in and see what you're doing, ask questions, observe. And so I think in welcoming people in and inviting people in and having them be part of the process, I think is very critical for ultimate success. And so it may not be any sort of in-depth sort of analysis or looking at underlying dynamics that can make the difference. It may be just a matter of just having people see what you do, see where their significant other is going. That can be very critical. Just inviting them in and making them feel part of a process at just a very superficial level may be enough to gain the support of the family members. Or let's say if you have an orientation for new individuals starting in a community rehabilitation program, if you can just begin a dialogue, and if there's a problem later on, you can call them in and the family members in, and you can talk about what some of the issues are. So I think that looking at the individual from the perspective, your consumer from the individual of the perspective that that person exists not in a vacuum or in isolation, but in some sort of interdependent constellation of others, is going to be very critical to ensuring success. And if we look at the fifth slide, titled Impact of Disability on Family, what we have here are three interrelated components of family dynamics. We have the social component, we have a psychological component, and we have an economic component. In terms of the social component, what we would have would be the interactions of individuals within the significant other or the family structure. The psychological component talks about issues of loss, of self-esteem, stress, insecurity. These are psychological issues. And then we have the economic issues of the individual in terms of the consumer's contribution to family well-being economically, the consumer's involvement in the family, and the impact of the individual, let's say if the consumer is someone who is on disability, or if this consumer is someone who had worked and is no longer able to work, all these have impacts on the family in terms of social functioning, psychological functioning, and economic functioning. And what you might see as one dynamic is that in some cases you might have some family members who see themselves as caretakers, and that caretaking may involve the caretaker and isolate that caretaker from other activities with other individuals, and may create an isolated environment in the family structure and functioning. And disability and injury, for example, can create stress in the family's environment. It can create tensions. It can create situations where where a disability causes stress, where families break up because of a member becoming injured or disabled. And so it's important to look at the impact of the individual in that family environment. And of course, you have situations where, if it's a developmental disability that the person has, you would have a situation in which the individual is been in that family structure, and the family has kind of over the years adapted to that functioning, and you'll see the roles that people play within the dynamics of the family and how they function. On the other hand, if someone's had a traumatic accident or injury, you're going to see a very different type of functioning, where all of a sudden you might have a family member who's been out of the house for many years, has to come back into the house and has to be taken care of by other family members, which can put stress on finances, which can create changes in the dynamics of the family. I've seen situations where you have spouses who get injured on the job, who've been working many years and been out of the house every day working, all of a sudden get injured, no longer working, and they're at home all the time. And that can dramatically affect how the family is functioning and how people perceive family members. I've seen situations where what you have is that someone's been working, they get injured, and they may feel, well, I can go back to work and I can do a lot of things, but you might have other family members who are being protective and view that person as being more disabled or unable to do activities than the individual. But as time goes on, the individual may internalize some of those feelings and begin to view him or herself as being as disabled as the other family members may perceive that person to be. So you have all these dynamics that come into play. Looking at the sixth slide, family-centered case management, it's kind of a summary of what I've been saying, and that is to identify family needs, member needs, looking at the dynamics of the family, identifying as you look at the dynamics, what are the resources that might be available to other family members if indeed they need some sort of assistance. And you might find that. You might find other family members can benefit from some sort of therapy or treatment or services, medical services, and that can be a critical factor of what you might do in order ultimately to help your consumer, to hook up significant others with other community resources, or even rehabilitation if appropriate. Also, in looking at family dynamics, as I was kind of saying earlier, what we see would be who are the ones that really have a significant impact on the individual, and then making contacts with them and being able to look to them as needed for support, and look to them as very critical components of the dynamics of the interactions that occur. And then in summary, what I'm basically have said for this past 15 or 20 minutes is that I think it's very important that as we can, and with the approval of our consumer and respecting privacy, certainly, it's important that we bring into the rehabilitation process consumers and the consumer's significant others, and to look at the family dynamics from the point of view of observation, getting input, and looking at how the person functions within the constellation of the family in order ultimately to gain the support and understanding of family members to achieve a positive employment outcome. And then finally, on the 7th slide, we've got some references that were used in this presentation listed, and you're certainly encouraged to look these up. So thank you. I hope this has been somewhat instructive and informative, and now we can move on to the next subject.